Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest webcast in EY's Women in Tech series. This episode today promises to be a meaningful discussion on a topic that's both overlooked and inescapable, and it's personal branding. Personal branding can be something of an umbrella term, and it can mean different things. So just to orient and frame what we're talking about in the next hour, we're focusing in on your personal brand as being something that others know us for and how others perceive us. And given that this is a Women in Tech series, we're looking at how that impacts people in tech and tech adjacent roles, elevating your voice, elevating your impact, your message, and your reach. I'm Jo Cunliffe. I'm an executive pitch coach and impact coach at EY. It's my job to help people strengthen their presence in a variety of high-stakes interactions, be they investor days, boardrooms, or pitches. I get to spend a lot of time with leaders who work in the tech space, and I know from them the difference that having strong executive presence and a clear personal brand that can make. Our discussion today focuses on three pillars. The first is positioning yourself and leading with purpose. This is the idea that personal impact is just that. It's personal, and it should be approached with intention. The second pillar is from perception to presence. We'll consider the gap that can sometimes exist between how we think others perceive us and how we actually come across. The third pillar is communicating with authentic impact. This is a topic people speak about a huge amount because it's really important. This is really about how to increase your personal impact while still feeling like you. As you can see on screen, I'm honoured today to be joined by four esteemed panellists from a variety of sectors. First, Anaïs Guzon, Vice President of Guidewire's EMEA Solution Advisory. She's led her current team since 2023 and has built trust with prospects and customers. She's been with Guidewire since 2011 and is the EMEA executive sponsor of Grow, an initiative supporting women's careers and growth in tech. Our second panelist is Kitty Alderson, Chief Information Officer at Evelyn Partners. Kitty has more than 20 years' experience in technology and growth strategies, including an industry pivot 5 years ago. Kitty focuses on enhancing client experiences and advocates for mental well-being. She's recognized with a Hot Topic Future CIO 100 award for 2 consecutive years running. Third, Caroline Porter, Global Head of Business Management, Data and Feeds at the London Stock Exchange Group. Caroline joined the London Stock Exchange Group in 2021 and has successfully grown the business with 14 years data business from the London Metal Exchange and the London Stock Exchange. She now leads the Data and Feeds business management function. Our fourth panelist is Katie Hinchcliffe, who's Deputy CSIO and Head of Security Operations at M&G plc, with responsibility for the detection of and response to cyber attacks. Katie's career spans nearly 2 decades and has seen her work across a variety of cybersecurity fields, from architecture and risk management to running cyber operations. She has also recently been a board member for the Deborah charity and supports the organisation which aids people living with epidermolysis bullosa. So those are our panellists, and the intent today is you're going to hear a lot of stories swapped and anecdotes shared from these 4 very different polemics and people who have different perspectives on the topic of personal brand. So let's kick off with the first pillar of our panel discussion. Quick flag for those who are listening. Today, we do welcome your questions. So if you have any questions as you're going, you'll note that there is a chat pane in the webcast. So you can use that to add your question. We'll be sure to try and cover as many as we can at the end. There will also be a short survey to pop up at the end, so watch out for that. So turning now to our very first question, and this one is for Anaïs. And Anaïs, we've said that the first pillar is all about positioning yourself with purpose and intent. Could you share how you personally have crafted your personal brand to reflect your leadership values and how this has influenced your role or your career?
Yes, thank you for that opportunity. It's funny, you know, I didn't know about the concept of personal brand until a few years ago. It's not something that was common as a concept as I started in the tech industry in the early 2000s in France. So the way I approach my professional career is the way I was raised by following values, which I guess became de facto my brand. And I realized that only after. And those values were very simple and, in fact, remain true throughout my career so far is be honest, behave with integrity, say when you don't know, say when you disagree, make your word your bond, etc. And be honest with yourself as well. I'll give an example about that in a minute. The second one is speak your mind respectfully. No matter who you're speaking to, there is value in your point of view if it's addressed properly. The third is do your best, provide your work, your highest level of attention and focus, and be ready to learn. And then the fourth is be curious, just observe, listen, and try. And so, in terms of examples about honesty, sometimes it's more important to know what you don't want than what you want. And it's easier to identify as well. So I started with this. In my first real job, I was hired as a new sales rep, and I soon realized that I didn't want to be a rep before I understood the solutions fully. And doing so led me to understand I'd rather become a solution consultant than a sales rep. And I did the same as well 7 years later when I was approached by Guidewire to become a solution consultant. I realized I was conflicted by switching teams, so to speak, and go to the same customers and market to sell them the value of a concurrent competitive solution. So I said so during the recruitment process, and therefore then I joined the enablement team instead. And so I think authenticity is realized through knowing what you don't want as much as what you want, and sometimes it's easier to start this way. I believe that as you become a leader over the years, it starts very early with the development of your own confidence and a capacity to be trusted. And the values I listed above really helped and provided that recipe. I didn't design this on purpose. It just happened to be raised this way and to have role models in my family and around me that were displaying these skills. They were all excellent listeners with high integrity, and they never really seeked the attention. Folks simply just came to them because they trusted them. So I tried to do the same every day in my work and personal life. And anecdotally, for the little things too, I would say dress up authentically, not how you think people will want you to. It'll be easier to move around the room and demo, present, address tough questions if you're not in a pencil skirt, in my experience anyway.
Beautiful. So to start with there, we've already talked about trust, authenticity, and even dress code. So amazing. Kitty, I'm going to come to you next. And I know your role has focused on driving growth and enhancing IT and tech operations in your organization. I'm curious what strategies you've implemented or employed, if any, to position yourself as a trusted voice in this very complex landscape that you work in.
Yes, thank you. And for those who know me quite well, I use a lot of analogies to explain or help explain how to approach things like this. So as I thought about this question, I thought about what are the values that are really important to me and what play out in the way I navigate this quite complex environment. And the analogy that came to mind was a lighthouse, a very unassuming building, and yet so vitally important to that communication between the business and the technology. And solid foundations become very, very important. Credibility and experience. Credibility has to be learnt, and domain knowledge as well. Deep domain knowledge become really important. And then that consistent delivery and strategic foresight. I guess continuing the analogy of the lighthouse, that clarity in communication. Communication can become incredibly complex. Every company has its own way of communicating, and so cutting through that and being very clear and transparent in communication becomes kind of vital to the way you engage to make the conversation tangible. And then that consistency and integrity. I know we've just been talking about integrity, but integrity is so important. Just like ships rely on that flickering light, that constant flickering light gives them a point in which to aim for. That principle of decision making, that principle of being very dependable, and in an environment that can be quite chaotic, integrity and consistency become absolutely vital. And then my first one is visibility and influence. That position yourself strategically so that you are that intersection between, or this is how I've done it, the intersection between technology, business, and leadership. So the voice is heard, or my voice is heard, when there are decisions of importance to me made.
Love that. I'm sure that analogy speaks to lots of us. So thank you for sharing that, Kitty. And Caroline, if we turn to you, and obviously leveraging your experience in navigating complex ecosystems, would really value your perspective on how you think professionals can shift from merely being seen to do the work to actually owning the strategic space and being a strategic leader within their organizations. This, by the way, is a question we get from lots of people, so curious how you'll answer.
Hi, Jo. Lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me to come along. I mean, in terms of that question, really what has been important, in terms of my journey has been really asking for lots of feedback and really being open to receiving that, so finding those trusted mentors, finding those people in your network, in your circle, whether that's internal, external. I always found that my customers were a great source for me to tap into in terms of, really understanding what the strategic imperative was around, how we were evolving the business, developing new solutions, trying to, solve customer issues. And actually, I think some of the feedback that I've got has really helped me at critical points in my career. So, really trying to develop, as Kitty said, and sort of show that domain expertise. Really, you need to get that feedback in order to sort of hone your craft and develop yourself, and do that in an authentic way. So really reflect in terms of what your own, personal style is, just as your choices in clothing. What do you feel comfortable doing? How do you like to do it? And really embrace that and your individuality. And actually, I think in my career, some of the feedback that I've got has been so critical. As I stepped into the role of being head of market data, I think I was just so, keen to show my domain expertise. I would almost like kill people with too much detail. And I got some really thoughtful feedback from a colleague, who reassured me that I was trusted in my role. I didn't need to kill people with really long emails or really, detailed answers. That I could really think about, how I wanted to make an impact and what I wanted to leave people thinking about. And, that was really what I should be, honing and thinking about my purpose in a much more meaningful way, rather than, really trying to sort of kill people with everything that I knew. And I think that was a maturity point. But for me, that really did then help me to sort of elevate the way that I was interacting, really get to the sort of strategic imperative of why we were doing things and how we were doing it. So that was really key for me, is just finding that circle of trust and finding those people and, being open and seeking that sort of feedback.
There's clearly so much to be said there about seeking the feedback loops, regardless of level. I think that's what you're saying there, is at any point this is really helpful, and to have that mirror held up and reflect back and work out. That's really fantastic. Thank you. And then Katie, welcome to you to the discussion. And I'm curious to hear your perspective on how we create lasting impact as leaders, and the extent to which our personal brand has any impact on how we're perceived long-term and into the future with people that we work with.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. It's really interesting. When I was first asked to do this webcast, it really got me thinking about my personal brand, and I realised that it hadn't really been something I'd been particularly deliberate or intentional about. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's been the reality for me. But it's really got me thinking. I had to do quite a lot of reflection in terms of my brand and how I've left a lasting impression in terms of my brand and my leadership over the years. And I think there's kind of three key aspects to that. I think one is, and I've heard some of the other talkers, presenters talking about this, is about brand being anchored within your values. I think that creates that authenticity, and that really strikes a chord with other people, which makes it much more memorable in terms of both your brand and then you as a leader. I think secondly, leading by example. So that links back to the authenticity. I think if your brand isn't authentic and isn't linked in with your values, and you haven't got that depth of brand, it can become a little bit superficial. So it becomes a little bit more do as I say, not as I do, maybe. So I think really landing that leading by example. But probably the third bit is the most important for me, and that's around investing in others. I think that's how you leave a little bit of your brand in everybody. So as a leader, all right, our role is developing others, raising them up, and you invest in those people, and that landing a little bit of your leadership and your brand in them. I think that is really key to leaving that lasting impact.
Amazing. Thanks, Katie. And that's certainly not a particularly easy question to answer. I don't think many of us wake up in the morning and think, what's my legacy project going to be today? But great breadcrumbs that you've shared about if it's authentic, if it's really who we are and we display those values, the more chance of the ripple. I have to point out, I love this analogy that you're co-sourcing amongst you, because we've got the Kitty lighthouse analogy, and then Katie, you're adding to that, but it needs to be anchored. So I think we're definitely at sea, and we're only in pillar one of this conversation. So I'm going to move us on now to the second pillar. And as a reminder, that is around this mythical gap that can sometimes appear between how we think we come across to others and how others actually perceive us. And this in itself can be a huge topic, but we're going to really explore this and think, is this real? Does it matter? What impact does this have? And what's in our control? What can we do about it? So Kitty, I'll start with you. And the question here is, what practical steps can we take to better understand how others perceive us?
Thank you. It's a brilliant question. Understanding how we're perceived is like trying to read the label of read a label from the inside of a jar. It requires intention, a bit of humility, and a massive dose of courage, because you need to find those moments and those individuals to help. So I've got three. Ask, but ask wisely. Really structured feedback is like gold. And I've used 360-degree reviews anonymously. They're massively helpful. We run something in the organization called a pulse survey. That's fantastic for getting feedback on my personal leadership. The comments are more valuable actually than the scoring, but you can read between the lines. And just informal check-ins, gathering honest insights. But it's how you ask those questions. How do I make people feel? What do I bring into the room are really open questions, and keep those questions open, but be ready for receiving the answers. And the second one is listen between the lines, because perception often lives in the nuance. It's not, often people aren't brave enough to just say it as it is. So there's nuance in the answers. Pay attention to how people respond in meetings, who seeks input, how ideas are received when you speak. There are often subtle cues that often reveal themselves. And then the third one is, and this one almost is for me the most important, but build a trusted mirror. So I've cultivated a small circle of truth tellers in the organization. They're people who are willing to honestly feed back to me, maybe things that I don't want to hear, but they are not just colleagues, they are sounding boards, someone who is prepared to challenge me and support me and help me grow. So there is elements to this that are just really important. And the final one is, it's a constant. So we're all changing all the time. And so, perception changes as well. So don't just do it once. Continue to always look for that feedback that brings that perception to life.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that, Kitty. And clearly this idea that you've latched onto of this trusted mirror, I could see the warmth on your face as you're describing it. So it's evident that that's actually something you rely on, that you use, that makes a difference. And so that's really valuable. Thank you for sharing it. Caroline, if we come to you now, and actually I'm going to ask a question on a really similar vein. Feedback plays a huge part in our personal branding, because like we've just heard from Kitty, it's understanding how others perceive us can enlighten us about where we may want to change, adapt, grow, or stay the same. Can you share with us how you've used feedback to align your intent about how you want to be perceived and how you actually are? Is this something that's ever been a theme for you?
Just reflecting on this conversation, that awareness of the personal brand, a lot of people are aware of branding. They look at the corporate branding, they understand the impact. Sometimes teams are thinking about how they're sort of articulating their value. But I think, many people are not really aware of how visible they are, and the fact that they can really shape that personal brand in a really meaningful way. So if that's, your unique story, your unique experience of your career path, can even be, experiences that you've had and challenges that you've had in your personal life. And I think the feedback for me was really important. As a woman and as a mother, when I came back into the workforce after I had my first child, you do sort of have a bit of a crisis of confidence when you've been out of the business and you haven't been there for all the coffee breaks and all the chats and in all the client meetings. And, I really did need to, sort of build that confidence back up. And so, finding that sort of, circle of trust, as we were speaking about, was really important for me. But also realizing that sometimes, you are going to get feedback that might be a little bit uncomfortable. So, as I kind of came back into the workforce and obviously you're reestablishing yourself back in the business, picking up all of those relationships, how you're leading the team and how you want to lead the team was something that I actually put a lot more thought into. I think I had been, probably in the early part of my career, probably quite limited in terms of, how I would share my experiences of some of the challenges that I would have, outside of the office. And what I realized is that by opening myself up and allowing, myself to be a little bit more vulnerable, and asking others for feedback about how that came across, that was a bit of a game changer for me, because then I realized that actually you can bring a lot of, some of the challenges and learnings that you have, from personal experience or, health challenges or family situations. And you can bring that back into the office and actually can help you to be even more impactful. And you can make connections with people that I think are on a little bit more of a deeper level.
And what you're talking about there, it's clearly it's true authenticity, and it's a bit of an opening up as well. So I think refreshingly for a lot of us, but gone are the days of having the facade version of ourselves at work, which
the work
totally
mask.
dissimilar. Yeah. Does that, am I chiming there? Is that where you were heading with this, being able to share more and talk more?
Absolutely. And look, sometimes it's a little bit uncomfortable at first. It's like anything, when you think about your personal branding, the more that you do it, the more consistent you are, the more intentional you are about how you want to lead, the kind of person that you want to be in the office, and that consistency with your values, outside of the office is actually, it's very natural and it doesn't take so much effort.
Excellent. And again, I can hear some commonality between your response there, Caroline, and Kitty, what you shared with us about this trusted mirror, the circle of trust, feedback loops coming in, and having our skin reasonably thick to want real honest feedback, which can sometimes make our hearts glow with pride and sometimes causes us to realize we had a blind spot, there's something we weren't aware of. And it's exactly why it's talked about in the big wide world of this perception gap between intent and impact. So sometimes feedback can be the most valuable tool to point out if there's ever been a drift, subconscious or conscious. So that's brilliant. Thanks, Caroline. I think, Katie, if I come to you next, and I'm curious now, during your career in tech, have you found ways to actively strengthen your brand across roles or teams? And if so, what are your recommendations for individuals in shaping their personal brand?
I think there's a piece about being intentional and acknowledging what I said in response to the last question around I haven't been massively intentional. But on reflection, I think if you're really clear about what your brand is, I think if it's anchored within those values, I think it's then testing. Are you showing up in alignment with that? Are you showing up to work like that? What does your digital footprint look like in terms of, does that stack up to how I want to be known and what I want my brand to look like? And an example of that might be a really practical, and it's maybe quite a noddy example, but something for me that is one of my values and part of my brand is around championing others, championing particularly females in IT, because I remember 20 years ago when I first got into information security and being kind of a bit of a lone female to an extent, it's something that I'm quite aware of. And so something really practical is making sure that other females are heard in the industry. So, and just testing myself against that and making sure I'm in alignment with what I want my leadership presence to be and what my brand is. And I think the other piece I talked to, and I love Kitty's trusted mirror. I think that's brilliant, because I think the other piece is this feedback, and I've been thinking about using feedback to how do you use that to shape your personal brand and how you're showing up, of how are people perceiving you, and does that align with your personal brand? And there is a risk sometimes with feedback, is that it's aligning with what someone else may think your brand should be. Then this is why I love Kitty's trusted mirror, because that's actually about finding those trusted people that actually you can take that feedback from, and you can use that feedback to reflect and adapt your style to make sure that those behaviours and actions are aligning with what you want in terms of your personal brand and your leadership presence.
That's brilliant. And I won't name the organisation, obviously, but I was recently working with a CTO in the banking sector, so a chief technology officer. And similar to what you're describing there with this awareness and checking in and testing yourself, they actually had a moment of realisation that their brand was very, very different in the external market and in the industry versus in the particular organisation that they worked in. And it wasn't necessarily a terrible thing, and both were strong. They were very different. So that person had an opportunity to reframe that and think, do I want these two divergent views, or why is there this slight disconnect, and what should I do about it? And they actually ended up realizing they could amplify the internal brand to catch up with this brilliant external brand in the market. And these things can happen. And without that testing process you've just mentioned, Katie, can be quite challenging to identify it, let alone do anything about it. So that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. Anais, I'll come to you next. And reflecting on what we've discussed already about personal brands, clearly I'm convinced at this point that all four of you have some great ideas on this topic. I'm really curious if you've got any role models in tech, or anyone who you've learned from and you think has a strong personal brand in tech and that you apply it to yourself, Or in the absence of strong role models, you might turn around to this question and say, absolutely not, there's a gap. So really curious.
Thank you. I alluded earlier the people who inspired me in my youth as I was, growing up and figuring out how to stand on my own. But later on, there was a few people that played an important part in the journey. And they may not necessarily be people that are famous to the industry, but I'll share a few examples. The first time a colleague next to me, I heard them say no to a customer, and as a result, I could see their credibility go to the roof and become 100% respected by the customer in an environment. We were in sales at the time where everybody was saying yes, even when it wasn't possible, and we will figuring out later. That was very inspiring to me. And I could see immediately the customer's reaction, which was the most important part. And I thought, oh, that's good, because you're shaped by the behavior of everybody around you, especially when you start a new job. Then that was an anecdote, but it stayed with me because after that, the customer said, we always believe him because sometimes he says no. When somebody always says yes, we don't believe them. So that stuck with me. Then there was Salim, is a former colleague of mine, now a friend. He was my first mentor. He taught me that I should believe in myself and remove the blinders that had fallen in my eyes, to be curious, to look outside the box that was presented to me. When some people say, oh, you should do it this way because it's always done this way. You're new at the job, so you follow the guidebook. But he said, oh, well, sometimes rewrite the guidebook. Redefine the best practices if your gut tells you they're no longer working. And so that really inspired me to stop believing that the grown-ups have all the answers, and to start believing that I'm either a grown-up too, or that everybody has the right to have a different perspective and add to the guidebook. Because at times you can get stuck in the old ways or the habit, and you forget to raise your head and take a breath and realize, wait a minute, it's different, and I have to adapt. Another thing that Salim taught me is don't forego the celebrations and be specific about it. And then don't underestimate the impact of appreciation gestures, if only a word, said out loud, said in public, depending on your appreciation language, it works and it goes a really long way. Then I had two mentors, Colleen and Eileen, and together they showed me the power of vulnerability applied to leadership, which was a little bit counterintuitive, specifically when you're a female in a leadership position. But the way Colleen was applying it was a real inspiration for many years. And I adopted some of her techniques and tips in my current leadership role, which funnily enough, only male are reporting to me. And when I came with this concept to them in my leadership meetings, that was an interesting moment. But they all, in a heartbeat, adopted it, and it became really interesting that the tone of the conversation changed. And then the last thing I would say that Eileen really taught me, and sometimes I channel my inner Eileen, is when you're stuck, start with why. Be intentional about what you're doing. Be more direct in your communication. I'm speaking here as, native language versus second, third language. There are differences in style. And it can be a bit painful sometimes to hear from someone who's a native speaker, your language is like weird in a way, that the words are right, but the sentence is wrong. So you have to be acceptant of that and realize that there are differences in style. And then in turn, share that feedback with others when English native speakers are speaking to a non-native English audience, right? Then also have fun, because it shouldn't be that hard. Work challenging is fun, but we should always seek ways to not making it harder on ourselves than it already is. And the last one that I was inspired by Eileen specifically is ask the good questions and then wait until you provide your provided answers. The listening and the shutting up part is super important advice that I received as well from this particular mentor.
Brilliant. I feel like we asked that question to the right person, Anais, because clearly you've got a lot of mentors, influencers, people who have given you practical tools and really specific things. And I think a reflection for all of us is just how many sources of inspiration there can be. And there's no reason not to draw on this and add to it. And I think a reflection point for everyone is, what are our sources of inspiration on this topic? And maybe the list will be as long and as diverse as that from Anais. It's super helpful. And as we draw to a close on pillar 2, before we jump to pillar 3, quick reminder, if you're listening to this and you've got questions that you would like any of the panelists to have a go at answering, please use the Q&A function that's in the chat. We can see a couple of questions coming through already, so that's great. So you've got a few more minutes to add your questions. So here we are at the 3rd pillar of today's webcast, and this is on authentic communication and authentic leadership. For some people, this means storytelling and speaking from the heart. For others, this means adaptability. Really, there's no definition of authenticity because it means something different to all of us. But we're going to tackle this pillar and hear what our views are on it. Caroline, if we start with you, storytelling is famously a powerful tool to communicate with impact. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What elements do you think are important in storytelling and leadership contexts, whether it's to connect at that emotional level or the intellectual level?
Yeah, I mean, I very much work in the data domain, and, you know, telling the story with that data, I think is really critical. And I think in terms of making the connections and finding those things that are relevant to you, you know, I'm an avid reader. I do love reading sort of, you know, information around various studies, if that's something within the industry. Love all the statistics that you've got on the slides here to sort of bring that story to life. For me, that's been really important with the storytelling because it's in the domain that, you know, I'm working, and having access to data means that we can do that amazing analysis. And I think sometimes, you know, you do take that for granted, you know, particularly in financial services. Sometimes we're drowning in data, you know, there's almost so much of it, but how can you really articulate the point that you're trying to make with the right data point? And you know, sometimes you need to keep working at that, you know. So for me, I think, you know, feeling confident and feeling that I'm able to discuss some of the more complex areas of the business, you know, has been about doing a lot of, you know, quiet time and refining my knowledge on it. But it's also about going, you know, to other domain experts. And I love that point that was made earlier is, you know, you don't have to know everything, but sometimes having a brilliant network can be that real enabler for you finding somebody in that network who maybe has their own story or can give their own personal perspective. And then you can, you know, expand your knowledge through that relationship with them. So I think that's the aspect that I really like. I do like data and statistics. I'm a bit of a nerd for that sort of stuff, but it's got to be relevant. You know, if people can't really, you know, understand why should I care about this? You know, ask those important questions to really get into that topic and find it useful, then, you know, unfortunately, sometimes the story can sort of fall a bit flat on its face. But that for me, I think is my part of the industry and data. And so I tend to lean on that quite heavily.
Yeah, really interesting, Caroline. Thanks. And there's a question that's come in the chat. So if we have time at the end, I'll put that to you. So heads up that people are very interested in what you're saying there. And sure. Katie, I'll come to you next, Katie. So being authentic, unfortunately, doesn't mean being unfiltered. Simply, it means being intentional. And how do you manage being authentic in your communication while also being intentional about the message that you want to communicate to your audience?
I think that going back to basics on this really, and putting some thought and care into communicating whatever those messages might be is the key. So having a really good grounding of what I'm communicating, why I'm communicating, helps me build that authenticity. So it becomes a story that I really believe in. And I think that shows when I communicate it without losing that intent, if I'm really clear about what that message is. It always has to be in my language. So I can't take somebody else's script and go and communicate that. I have to craft it into a Katie and into a Katie language. again, that gives me the authenticity in terms of the message. And I think a level of transparency and not diluting the message. There's something that people really respect about people being direct. I think sometimes authenticity and impact can be at odds a little bit, where people just don't put that effort and thought into how others are going to experience receiving that message. So key bit for me around that is treating people like adults. So putting the effort in up front as opposed to having to kind of recover the situation afterwards.
And that, what you just mentioned there, is a topic that comes up in a lot of coaching conversations I see across the financial services sector and beyond. And what you're saying is preempting and giving that forethought. How will this be received? What are the likely reactions? And I think a lot of people find success the more they can lean into that and preempt and even bring it into the room and call it out before the questions are asked. Sometimes that itself can be the differentiator in how well people are either with you or not quite yet. So there's a lot there that's really very valuable to share. Thank you, Katie. Anais, this topic that we're talking about today can sometimes be unhelpfully labelled as a soft skill or a soft power, and it can be overlooked. So I'm curious, can you share with us an example of how you've used your personal brand to influence people in a way you think has really mattered?
Yes, I was always puzzled by the word soft in front of skills, because it makes it like, it's soft, it's sweet. It's really not. You can be really strong with your brand. So I think we should find another way to say soft skills, because I've been working in enablement, soft skills around presentation skills, tough question handling. Like, this word is undermining the power of these skills. And I would say at work, I'm pretty much the same than I am in personal life. I just tailor my appearance, I guess, in the context of what I'm talking to the audience and the situation. But I recently did a personality test, and it looked like there's just one of me, depending on the context. And I'm saying this because I don't feel like I'm using my brand. I'm just being me all the time per the values that, we discussed above. And so one particular example that I think I'm known for is my directness. And so I have developed this ability to, I believe, successfully navigate conversations when I spot a misunderstanding, for instance. So I will chime in when I believe the question was misunderstood by the person answering them, because I spotted misunderstanding in the language barrier or some context is missing. And I've developed a way to say it firmly with a smile on the face, but at the same time, it's a whole vocabulary, it's a whole attitude that you develop where your eyes are smiling, but you're saying respectfully, I believe you missed the point. I believe so-and-so, because we talked about it earlier, was meaning that, and you chimed in. If I can, I will check in advance with the person, but sometimes only an eye contact will suffice to confirm it. And so that's why I wouldn't say it's soft. I think it can be really edgy, like sharp. And I think we do it
sharp,
all the time.
Sorry, you're in place. You finish?
Oh, sorry. I would say edgy as in sharp, right? It's like a sword. It's not soft.
I just couldn't help but comment. I love that. And I hear a lot of people try and reframe that soft doesn't work, but calling it as sharp as a sword, I think is a brilliant way to describe it. And coupling technical skills with super strong communication and impact skills is exactly as you're saying, can sharpen your sword, and it can mean you've got your team with you, and it can mean things just feel easier. So loads of benefits to it. So thank you for sharing that. I'm about to come to you, Kitty, for what's actually the last question on the third pillar, and then we'll open up to Q&A that we've got from people listening. So Kitty, a question on adaptability, and we can't really escape this as a theme in the tech world. How have you managed to build your brand that's rooted in your values and this lighthouse you've talked about, while also adapting to changes and the fact that your audience is diverse and have different requirements of you? So how do you manage this adaptability aspect?
Yeah, sure. Well, absolutely. Adaptability is really the heartbeat of leadership with a small L, in tech, but across the board. In short, I've I am building, I'm always going to be building my brand that's both rooted and responsive. So grounded in values, shaped by experience, and then tuned by the rhythm of the people I serve. So if I just explain that a bit more, it all starts with my North Star. So my brand is anchored in values like transparency, curiosity, empathy. Those are just not words. Those are lenses through which I make decisions, I lead my teams, I communicate my vision. And it gives me a constant foundation even when everything else shifts around me. So those are my base component parts. I then flex the delivery, not the integrity. So I've learned to tailor my style without diluting my message. So with engineers, I speak about systems and scalability, and with the execs, I try and translate that technology into business outcomes. And with external parties, I focus on trust and transformation and cost normally as well. And the tone changes, but the truth stays exactly the same, grounded on those roots. And then I let experience shape that narrative. So I use my own personal journey, wins, setbacks, and pivots as storytelling fuel that people can connect with. People can connect with stories. They don't really connect with titles. Titles just aren't connectable with. And by sharing lessons and moments of growth and moments of learning, I've then continued to build my brand that's not just credible, but actually it's relatable, I hope. And I sometimes hear of, oh yeah, I did that, or that happened to me. How did you manage to circle around it? And then there's the staying visible and staying human, or speak like a human, not like a headline. Another way of putting it. Show up consistently, whether it's through leadership, through mentoring, or simply being present in the room. I found that authenticity really resonates more than a polished pitch, for want of a better term. People trust what they can really feel. And then listen, adapt, and repeat. So listen, treat feedback as a compass, as I spoke about earlier. And then when you sense a disconnect, I double down on that. I recalibrate myself and then adapt and help. That helps me stay relevant without losing kind of the essence of who I am.
Yeah, love that. So using it as a compass, but then also being happy if it tells you a direction that feels off.
Yes.
You maybe nudge towards it, or maybe you don't, based on what you're saying there about staying true to yourself. So brilliant. So, well, thanks to the four of you, because we've rattled through those three pillars and we've covered authentic impact, the difference between perception and reality. And then we've also discussed the extent to which this is intentional versus only organic. So lots of big themes. You'll be pleased to know there are questions in the chat. So we'll start with one that's come in, and it's about reflecting back on the early stage of your career. So the question is this: looking back to the early stage of your career before you've had all this experience and all these achievements, what helped you keep believing in yourself and moving forward? And I think, Katie, if we could direct that one to you. So this one's about belief in the early stages.
Yeah, so I'm not convinced that there was every day that I did believe in myself. And so I think the key to the keeping moving forward is having other people that did. So having that trusted network of people that did believe in me and kind of kept me going in terms of that. And part of that is, I see there's a dual role as a mentor. So part of being a mentor, I think, is also being a champion of a mentee. So I think that's something that has absolutely helped keep me going in the mentors that I've had over the years. And then I think alongside that is knowing what's good for me in terms of management style and who I've worked for. I've generally worked for some really good people, and if I've ended up working for someone who hasn't been great for me, I've generally made a change in terms of that, and looked for leaders who I know suit my style well, and where they have suited my style, that's where I've really kind of thrived and kept moving forward.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katie, for taking that one. And Anais, a question has come in, which heads up, I'm going to direct your way because it's about role models. And you mentioned role models being so formative to you. The question is, what advice would you give for identifying and approaching a mentor in your workplace or outside your organization?
Listen to what makes someone, listen to the things that make someone inspiring to you. If you listen to someone speaking or behaving and you feel like it's inspiring, it's somebody you either want to emulate or you would like to have their feedback on. And once you've identified that, I would say generally, candidly, approach them. Just ask them. In fact, people will be really glad to help you in one way or another. And mentorship can take many shapes. It could be formal and structured and scheduled, or it could be ad hoc. And just go with your ask and authentically say why. And that will be feedback for the person as well. I haven't refused anyone who's come to me. Sometimes I've redirected them to someone else because time zones and bandwidth, but I will always try and help in one way or another. And it's just, yeah, try and see if you'd like that person to help you or give you advice. Just go to them and genuinely ask them very kindly what you'd like their help for.
Brilliant. It's kind of one of those if you don't ask, you don't get scenarios. And actually, a small piece of advice, if I may, is neuroscientists all agree that if we ask people for advice, they're much more likely to give it to us than if we ask for feedback. So we've talked a lot in this hour about the value of feedback, but there can be transformative value in asking it in the form of advice. Like you say, Anais, people love to be asked, so it works. So there's one last question. I'll read it out, and then Caroline, Kitty, whichever of you feel like you might have an answer to share with us here. It's not an easy one, but it's important. And the question is, in many industries, executive levels are still male-dominated. Sometimes the culture or personalities can feel intimidating. Are there any strategies you recommend for building trust and influence with male leaders while staying authentic and not having to act like a man to succeed?
Yeah, so I can go first. Maybe we can both answer this. I can certainly go first. So first of all, you've got to get around the intimidating word. That would be my first piece. And I was taught years and years ago. Imagine them doing a natural thing that we all have to do is often a good way to remove the intimidating element of the human being. Because once you've cracked being intimidated, which is obviously a personal thing, it's something you feel, then you can get back to your authenticity and your back to your values. And if you stick to your values, in my case, it's, as I said earlier, that transparency, being curious and opening up conversations, and perhaps a bit of empathy as well in there. You can break down those barriers, but you should act like you, not like anyone else. Don't fall into the trap of trying to be something you're not, because you will lose credibility and authenticity.
Brilliant. Caroline, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Having some positive self-talk is really, really helpful in these situations. You know, you're walking into a room, position yourself in a place at the table where you're equal to your peers, whoever they are. You know, don't sit at the back of the room. You know, just simple things like that. You know, I think giving yourself that positive talk, reminding yourself that, look, everybody's human, you know, and you have a place at the table as well. And I think actually the way that you think about the space and the way that you take up that space, particularly in a business environment, you know, I've often through my career, you know, been a single woman, you know, in a group of men. But, you know, if I sat at the back of the room, I was almost positioning myself, you know, outside of the conversation. So I would always really be deliberate almost to the point where I would like to get into the room early so I can choose where I want to sit. I know that sounds really simple, but for me, that really helped. So, hopefully that's a little tip that you guys can think about in if you're in the office.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Caroline. And then as we move to close now, I think what everybody listening to this would love to know is your final sound bites on your top tips for having strong personal brand. So what we'd love here is what you ultimately think is the most important for when it comes to personal brand. And Caroline, as you were the last to speak, we'll start with you first.
Sure. I mean, look, whether you feel it or not, you're visible. So you can cultivate your personal brand. So be deliberate. I think we've heard some amazing, tips throughout this whole session, which actually some of them I'm going to take away for myself. But the more that you think about it, the more that you're consistent, the more that you show up in the way that you want to be perceived. And, the more thoughtful you are about reacting to the feedback, I think then you can just, cultivate that personal brand, to really be as unique as you are.
Amazing. Katie, we'll come to you next.
Thanks. I would say we're all brought up at school that we have to be good at absolutely everything. And I think it's a good reminder that we don't have to be good at everything. And our brand should be about the things that we are good at and the things we want to be known for. And it's okay to bring in people to be good and cover the things that you may be not so good at.
Amazing. And Kitty, if we come to you.
Sure. So the panel, all of us here, we are all a result of people who believed in us. They saw something in us that they wanted to nurture and develop, and we have all taken it on and continued that journey. So my top tip is, people have spent time on us. Give back as others give to you in equal measure, if not double, because it is through us working with others, we will find that they will be here talking like we have in years to come. And I massively value the giving back in spades. Almost over and above now, my own personal development as I go into the next stage of my career, to bring that next generation through.
Thank you. Brilliant, Kitty. And Anais.
I would align with what everybody else has said. Remember that the personal brand is never acquired. It's not a destination that you get to and then that's fine, it won't change. So it's a journey. So never stop learning, never stop evolving. It will evolve with you. And to piggyback on what the former panelist just said, even as you give back, you develop your brand. So everything you do is you, and that's your brand. So just keep on learning. There is no end. That's a good thing.
Beautiful. So to sum up for me, of all the things we've covered, what's most stood out is that it's got to be grounded, our personal brand, and the idea that it's a journey, not a destination, I think is a really valuable one for us to all have, and nobody thinking that they're the finished product. Obviously, everybody on this call, I'm sure, would like to extend a thank you to the panelists for generously giving us your time and your top tips. For those who have listened, if you could please wait on the line for a short moment when the call finishes, what you're going to see is a survey pop up straight away. That's your opportunity to give feedback and also share suggestions for what other themes or topics you'd love to hear about in future webcasts that are part of this Women in Tech series by EY. So a huge thank you to everyone for taking part and making the hour to discuss this important topic. Thank you very much and goodbye.